Hi, my name is Natalie, and this is Natalie Lawyer Chick. I'll be discussing popular topics through a legal lens. Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe.
Hey YouTube, and if you're a returning subscriber, you're a chicklet. So hey lawyer chicklets. My name is Natalie. I'm a criminal defense attorney. How's it going? This is part 3 of the Michael McDonald saga. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for the amazing feedback and support that I received on part 1 and part 2. I thought I would be able to sum this up in 2 parts. It was virtually impossible. It had to be 3 parts because of how long and convoluted this saga is. With all that being said, make sure that you watch parts 1 and part 2 so that you know exactly what's going on. You don't want to be caught off guard here. There's a lot of background information. So fast forward to January of 2020, and Michael McDonald is now facing charges while he's awaiting sentencing on the perjury case. His new case, charged with 5 counts of interception of wire communications related to phone calls which he recorded between himself and Candace in October of 2016, allegedly without her consent. The events from the wiretapping charges, the illegal interception of wire communications for recording the phone call, that happened before the perjury and burglary case, but it didn't come to light until after the situation with the perjury and the burglary case, the forged letter, became a new case. So no one knew about this other than Michael until sometime after that. The divorce between Michael and Candace was finalized in 2016. Michael was posting the videos from his divorce online and also participating in this group called Veterans for Politics and Nevada Court Watchers. In Nevada Court Watchers, he would share these videos and say, oh, look at these terrible things that are happening to me. Basically, my wife is evil and I'm being persecuted by this unjust system and the system needs to change. And people were, watching his videos and basically giving him the feedback that actually, what you're saying isn't very accurate. It seems like you are the wrongdoer here. It seems like the court is not incorrect with your particular case. One of those people in particular was Mark DeCero, who is the co-administrator of Nevada Court Watchers. He's also a former radio personality, morning radio personality in the Las Vegas, Nevada area. So he's probably very well known to the general public because of that. He is communicating with Michael, who's posting these videos on YouTube and sharing them with Nevada Court Watchers. Michael shares with him his own Google Drive, telling Mr. DeCero, Mark DeCero, hey, look at this stuff. This will basically prove that I'm right? It is hundreds of documents inside of the Google Drive, just like the Google Drive. It's the same Google Drive that he shared with the officer in the perjury case who was serving the warrant on his house. And he asked the officer, is there any way he could help? And he showed the officer what was inside of his Google Drive. And then on the Google Drive was the incriminating forged letter from the licensed marriage and family therapist. The same thing goes with the Google Drive that he shared with Mark DeCero, which again, I believe is the same exact Google Drive. It was basically unfettered access to all of these documents, and many of them contain some types of incriminating information. Mark DeCero doesn't go through the entire Google Drive at first because it's so voluminous, but eventually Michael posts a collage on YouTube with photographs of his children, photographs of Candace in a compromising position, and playing underneath the collage audio recordings of conversations that he'd had with Candace in what appeared to be October of 2016. It seems like there were 5 separate recordings, and each of these recordings had to do with Michael and Candace discussing or arguing about the situation concerning their divorce, their child support issues, their child custody arrangement issues, visitation, things of that nature. There were some very sensitive things in these phone calls. So as I mentioned in video number 1, one of the children had some medical issues and the medical issues are very sensitive. And Michael was talking to Candace about these medical issues. Candace was responding to them. Michael was blaming this medical issue on, at the time, Candace's boyfriend, Joe Ruiz, and Candace was making it plain that it was impossible for Joe Ruiz to have caused these injuries because of what medical professionals said, the fact that Joe was never alone with the children. Michael was accusing her of leaving the children unattended, asking for more parenting time. Candace was upset that Michael wasn't paying any child support. He was basically saying, I'll pay child support if you allow me to see my kids more. He was begging her to get back together, even though the marriage was over at this point. She was dating, it was over. He was refusing to sign the decree of divorce. So he was refusing to sign. The court was going to have to sign on his behalf. That's basically what the 5 phone calls entailed. It was very emotional and upsetting, and clearly very private conversations that should have stayed between Michael and Candace. Michael shared these things on YouTube on his own Michael McDonald channel. So Nevada court watchers who, Michael shared this video with, that he had also shared on his YouTube, basically the people that are in that group said, this is a crime. You cannot record people without their consent in Nevada. I hope that you're aware of that, because it's a crime to record without your consent. Well, Michael takes that video down, and then some weeks later, I think about 5 weeks later, reposts the video to his channel. But this time, periodically throughout the video, there are pauses in which Michael can be heard saying, this phone call is being recorded, and then a pause, and then the conversation picks back up. Very unnatural and unrealistic that that's what was happening in the call, trying to make it seem as though as he's talking to Candace, he's saying, hey, Candace, this phone call is being recorded. And then they go right back to their conversation. It was clear from Mr. DeCiro, who worked in radio previously, that's the reason I brought it up, who was very familiar with audio recordings, and also by Candace, who eventually became aware of these things. It was very clear that this had been dubbed over. He was also panned basically for doing that. And people said, it's so clear that this is dubbed over, that Candace didn't give her consent to be recorded. And there was a previous version of this in which there was no, audio cutting in and saying this phone call is being recorded. We know that you just made this up and this is a crime. So basically he takes that video down and that video is gone. Well, Mark DeCiro goes into the Google Drive that Michael had shared with him. And in the Google Drive that Michael had shared with him was the audio recording of the phone calls without the dubbed over voice of this phone call is being recorded. But clearly phone call conversations in which, Michael and Candace are having very intimate conversations about their relationship, and Michael has recorded them without the consent of Candace. So Mark DeCiro takes this to Candace and makes her aware. And he said that he told Candace about it before going to the police because he wanted to give Candace the control over whether or not she wanted to pursue it, because maybe she didn't want to pursue it. Who knows? So Candace decides to take this to the police. This is some years after this event actually happened that she knows about it. A police officer by the name of Detective Kirshner takes up an investigation into these phone calls. The investigation is pretty limited. All that it really entails is getting a statement from Candace that she did not consent to being recorded during these phone calls, contacting Mr. DeCiro for Mr. DeCiro to send over the phone calls that he had from the Google Drive. Mr. DeCiro had to basically convert them into like an MP4 audio format and from the format that they were in prior, so that the officer could actually listen to them. That becomes an issue at the trial. And he did not converse with Michael. He didn't interview Michael at all to try to get Michael's side of things, to try and see if Michael actually did the recordings or did the posting or anything like that. They were no longer able to get the phone records. They basically didn't realize what Michael had done until sometime after that. So the case proceeds to a jury trial. And at this point, Michael is still pending the perjury and burglary charges, but it proceeds to a jury trial. and the trial results in a mistrial because the state turned over evidence too late. It comes back for trial after Michael has been convicted of perjury and burglary. And Michael is now back in custody. He's back in jail because if you remember, Judge Hardcastle revoked his bond as to burglary and perjury and forgery charges. So he's awaiting his court date. At the trial, Mr. Mueller makes a motion to consolidate everything into one charge. Basically, because the phone calls that were recorded, almost none of them ended with a goodbye, and absolutely none of them started with a hello. It really wasn't immediately apparent, according to Mr. Mueller's argument, that these were separate phone calls. These could have been all one long ongoing phone call. And since it could have been one long ongoing phone call, he should only face one charge of illegal interception of wire communications, which is basically wiretapping, right? So he should only face one charge of that. The reason that that's important is because if Mueller had been successful in putting all the charges together, then Mr. McDonald would only be facing one maximum possible penalty to this felony charge. And he basically would not be facing the charges being stacked on top of each other if they were separate incidents. So that's what Mr. Mueller was trying to do, but that motion was unsuccessful. The judge in the case was Judge Silva, who was really, really good, in my opinion. She was very fair. She was very even-keeled and level-headed and professional, and maintained the professionalism of the courtroom. Because as I said before, Mr. Mueller received a lot of condemnation from the general public because of his courtroom demeanor. And to really, in his defense, I think that he was ultimately trying to be a zealous litigator on behalf of his client. But there were times that I believe that he kind of, overstepped a little bit, or maybe got too carried away in his passions, and kind of took on the role that McDonald played in his underlying family law cases. He kind of adopted the same type of courtroom behavior that Mr. McDonald had in family law and family court. And we should never really do that. We should always try to be as professional as possible. But he was a fighter. And, again, I have to at least point that part out, because the rest of the things I'm going to say are going to be kind of critical. But I just want to be fair about the fact that I think that he was a fighter, and he's really smart, and he clearly knows the law very well. He just had a crack case, and I think at some points he let his emotions get the better of him. So after that motion was denied and they were on their way to proceed to trial, the state placed on the record that there was a plea offer that they had made to Mr. McDonald, and that Mr. McDonald was rejecting the plea. So the plea offer was to one count of unlawful interception of wire communications for recording Candace, which is basically what Mueller wanted. He just wanted it to be one count. So they were offering a plea just to one count in exchange for a suspended sentence, meaning no more jail time, plus probation, plus mental health treatment. So the reason that the prosecution would put that plea offer on the record is to make sure that it upholds the integrity of the case in case it goes to a conviction. So in case he's convicted after a jury trial, one of the things that he can appeal for is ineffective assistance of counsel, or at least he can request a new trial for that basis. He can get post-conviction relief for that basis, and the conviction could possibly be overturned. And one of the reasons you can get a claim of ineffective assistance of counsel is because counsel did not communicate to you a plea offer. That is ineffective. We are obligated by the law, defense counsel, to relay any plea offer that the state makes to our client. We have to relay it to our client. So even if we don't like the plea offer, or we don't think our client is going to want to take the plea offer, we are legally bound to tell your client about every single plea offer. So it makes sure that later on, Michael can't say, oh, I never knew about the plea offer, now I get a new trial. And it was very clear that that was the right thing for them to do, which was to put it on the record, because they don't always do that, but that's usually why they do it. It was the right thing for Ms. Mishler to do by putting it on the record, because Mr. McDonald said, oh, I never heard of this plea offer. I don't know anything about this plea offer. And Judge Silva was like, Mr. Mueller never told you about the plea offer, which I find very hard to believe, because again, Mr. Mueller seemed to be very diligent. At the very least, he seemed to be very, very diligent. And Michael's reasoning was, oh, I was working, I was really busy, and, I really didn't know what this plea offer was. I really didn't totally understand it. I don't really know anything. But you have to remember that Michael is the same person that went to an entire trial in the municipal court, the lower district court, basically, in one of the violation of a protective order cases, and testified to Judge Markey that he didn't even know that he had gone to trial. He didn't even understand that he had been in an entire trial in front of a judge and didn't understand that he'd had a trial. So you can't really trust Michael when he says he doesn't understand, because he'll just say that to try and get out of responsibility. So Judge Silva gave a recess for lunch and for Mr. McDonald to speak with Mr. Mueller about the plea offer again. We knew that he already relayed the plea offer to him, but he was going to talk to him about the plea offer again. So he speaks to Mr. Mueller about the plea offer. They come back, and Judge Silva makes Mr. McDonald put on the record whether or not he's accepting or rejecting the plea. He rejects the plea and is like, no, I'm innocent, Your Honor. I can't take a felony plea. It really would have been better had he taken that plea, because what ended up happening to him was so much worse than probation and a suspended sentence. So much worse. So they proceed to the trial, and the opening statement was, in essence, a recitation of everything that I've told you already about what the state knows, and that there were 5 phone calls, and that Mark DeCiro really got the ball rolling by informing Candace, who informed the police, and then everything happened from there. And then Mark DeCiro handed over the recordings that he had to the police and did the conversions. And that basically Candace didn't give permission to be recorded, which is a major element of the offense. While Mr. Mueller's opening statement is a valid defense, guys, a super valid defense, which is basically, this did not happen this way. The state cannot meet its burden because they don't have any evidence to show that these were phone calls. They don't have any evidence to show that Mr. McDonald is the one that did the recording. And anyone that would say that Mr. McDonald did the recording or that these are phone calls cannot be believed, because they have a motive to lie against Mr. McDonald. So he said, Candace has a motive to lie against Mr. McDonald because she's full of bile and vitriol. That's another time he's called her bileless on multiple occasions. Now, trial strategy wise, given the contentious nature of the relationship between Mr. McDonald and Candace, it is a understandable trial strategy. It may be distasteful to a lot of people, but that is a trial strategy a lot of defense attorneys would make, which would be to say, this woman hates him so much and she has a motivation to lie, and she's lying that these are phone calls. This could have been a private conversation that someone else recorded. We have no idea, and she has every reason to lie on him. That's what Mr. Mueller argued in opening statements, and again, it's a reasonable trial strategy. In addition, there was the other argument that Mr. DeCiro had the ability to manipulate the audio, and that we don't know that the audio that you hear today is true to what actually was recorded, right? And so there's no way to know if these audio recordings are authentic. And everyone has a motivation to lie, basically. And the police have a motivation to lie because Candace is connected to the police. And so you should find him not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So those were the opening statements. As far as what we know, there's what we know when we are looking at this case, especially at the trial. As far as, we see the things that Michael has done in the underlying family law case. I can guarantee you that almost none of those jurors knew anything about any of this. They don't know that, Michael had really been stalking Candace, that there had been allegations of domestic violence. They don't know any of that because that would have prejudiced Mr. McDonald. All they know is that there's a divorce case and that there were allegedly recordings that were made. They don't know about the forgery. They don't know about the perjury. They don't know about all the tactics he undertook with the children and with the courts in order to try to defeat the divorce process. They don't know about any of that. All they know is what they see in evidence during the trial. And that's the way that Michael gets a fair trial. So that's why Mr. Mueller's opening statement and, defense theory makes a lot of sense, because these people are completely fresh eyes to this situation. So the first witness that was called was actually Mark DeCero, the co-administrator of Nevada Court Watchers. And his testimony was pretty much straightforward, that, it came to his attention about the McDonald divorce. He got the Google Drive in November of 2017. He told Candace about it. Candace told the police, and then it was off from there. The jury did ask some of the witnesses questions, which was interesting because that is a mechanism that's very limited in some states. So my state, for example, does not allow the juries to ask any questions during the trial, but Nevada is one of the very few states that allows that. So the jury was allowed to write down questions and submit it to the judge, and Judge Silva would determine if she wanted to ask the question or not. So I thought some of the jury questions would be kind of interesting to you guys. So the jury wanted to know, did Candace acknowledge that she was being recorded in the audio, after the audio cut in and said, this audio is being recorded? And no, she did not. So it's not. So basically, Michael would say, this is being recorded, and then Candace wouldn't say anything in response to that. She would just keep talking afterwards. So that is like super duper interesting. Why did Mark DeCero contact Candace instead of going directly to the police, since he knew that this was illegal from his job in radio? And he said that he wanted to give her the opportunity to make the decision if she wanted to take this to the police. And they also wanted to know about, how or why he converted the audio files for the police to be able to listen to them. Did he change them in any way? And he said he didn't. He just converted it from one file format to the next file format. On cross-examination, what Mr. Mueller was ultimately trying to get to was bias. What is Mark DeCero's interest in this case, or interest with the parties, that would make him want to testify in favor of Candace and not in favor of Michael? Why would he potentially lie on Michael? So he bore out that Candace was roommates with Blair Davies, a woman that had worked at the radio station that he worked at, and that apparently Candace had met him like many, many years prior, like back when Hanson was still a thing. I guess she won some tickets for Hanson or something, and she went down to the station, and Mark was working there, but I guess she met him. Neither one of them remembered the encounter. It happened so long ago, but she was also roommates at some point with one of the people that worked at the radio station. So basically, Mr. Mueller was saying that because of this relationship that they had previously, that Mark was going to lie in favor of Candace. Lie to what exactly? I'm not quite sure, but maybe like manipulate the audio recording in some way in order to help Candace in her case. And so that's a lot of what the questions were that he was asking. And also, I think Alex Gabato had at one point in time represented Michael McDonald, but so did almost every single attorney who touches family law issues. And Mark DeCero was, and probably still is, a paralegal for Alex Gabato. So he was trying to bear out that there might have been some bias because of that against Michael. And then he was trying to paint Mark DeCero as like this busybody snooper who was not minding his business, basically. Because remember, Michael had voluntarily given, just like he voluntarily gave to the police officer, voluntarily given Mark DeCero his Google Drive with the incriminating audio recordings on it. Mr. Mueller was saying, look, he only gave you the Google Drive so that you would look at these limited things, and then you went and rifled through the entire Google Drive. And that's not actually true, because he gave him the Google Drive and only access to some files. And in the files that he gave Mr. DeCero access to were the incriminating audio recordings. So Mark didn't do anything to like step outside of the consent that Michael gave him. But those were the questions that were asked of him on cross-examination, which I thought were pretty decent questions, which is like, try to make him look like he's a liar, try to make him look like he's a weirdo for being so interested in this case. But that doesn't really work in this particular case, because Michael is the one who made all of his information public. and voluntarily like spoke with this guy and gave this guy his information from his Google Drive. Like, why would you do that when you have been illegally recording your wife? And then there's also those letters that were written, you know, that were forged from the licensed marriage and family therapist. There were so many things in there that were incriminating to him, and he was just giving so many people access to it. So yes, it's a little weird that this radio host like was inside of his Google Drive, but it wasn't because he hacked the Google Drive. It's because Michael had given him access to it. That was basically the tenor of the cross-examination. It became very contentious. They were like fussing with each other, back and forth, talking over each other, cutting each other off. It was a very lively cross-examination, and Judge Silva had to intervene several times to like get them back on track. It was very clear that, like I said, I feel like Mr. Mueller's emotions were kind of getting the better of him a little bit, because although it's clear he wanted to rattle Mr. DeCiro seemed to be rattling him in turn. On redirect, so redirect examination is what the state uses, or the person who's the proponent of the witness, what the state uses to rehabilitate the witness after they've been torn down on cross-examination, or to clarify things that became muddy or unclear during the cross-examination. Because our role as defense attorneys is to muddy the waters as much as possible, to make things as unclear as possible, so that the jury throws their hands up and says, I don't know what to think. I have to find the guy not guilty because the state's case is not clear. So the things that Ms. Mishler clarified with Mr. DeCiro was that he became aware of Michael because of Michael posting in Veterans in Politics and sharing his videos online over and over again. And the video started to become viral. That's how he became aware of him. And Michael was asking for advice and seeking people out for advice on what to do in his family case. And that Michael at no point ever terminated Mr. DeCiro's access to the Google Drive, even though this Google Drive was causing him a whole bunch of issues. He still allowed Mr. DeCiro to have access to it. So again, you can't call Mr. DeCiro a snoop if you gave him access to this drive that had all this incriminating evidence on it. The next witness was Detective Kirshner with the police department. He'd been an officer with them for 20 years. He says he didn't seek out Mr. McDonald to interview him because it was a domestic violence related case. Even though Michael and Candace no longer live together, it was his experience in these types of cases that when you go out to meet the person that is the alleged perpetrator of the domestic violence, they can try and escalate the abusive situation. So they didn't want to bring it to his attention that they were investigating him for these wiretaps, which I thought was pretty interesting, because it does create a very good argument for the defense that you never even got his side of the story. Okay, so like you really don't want them to talk to your client because you don't want your client to say anything incriminating. But to a jury, you can always say he was never given a chance to tell his side of the story. And if they had just given him a chance, they would have realized that this was not a crime. He didn't do anything wrong. And so you should find him not guilty. So, I understand why they don't contact, the suspect, but that's just something to consider. There was no influence by any outside parties. Mark DeCiro, he didn't know Mark DeCiro at all. Candace, he didn't know Candace at all before this happened. He simply investigated Michael off of the strength of the evidence of the case. And basically that's a pretty consistent theme throughout this trial and the previous trial, that Mr. Mueller was trying to make it seem as though the only reason Michael was being investigated was because of, his political involvement or people having a grudge against him. But ultimately, again, it's really hard for those types of arguments to sustain themselves, to be successful, because if you're still doing the underlying criminal acts, it doesn't matter really if the reason the state is coming after you is because they don't like you. You don't have clean hands, you committed a crime, so they're gonna come after you. On cross-examination, Mr. Mueller got Officer Kirshner to say that it is unusual to prosecute someone for recording phone calls, but that he didn't agree that they didn't do enough investigation in the case. He said that they did just enough investigation to show that these were phone calls and that they were recorded by Michael, but he did bring out some very good questions and answers, which was basically he doesn't know for sure when the phone calls were made, and there's no way for him to certainly know where Michael was when the phone calls were recorded. Because in other states like California, if Michael was making the phone calls in California and recording from California, then what he was doing would be legal in California. It would only be illegal if he was in the state of Nevada or a two-party state at the time that the phone calls were made. So I thought that that was a great way to raise reasonable doubt, because one of the elements of the offense has to be, one of the implied elements has to be that the phone calls occurred in the state of Nevada in order to give Nevada jurisdiction, number one, but in order for the two-party consent rule to apply as well. So that was a super interesting point, that you don't really know where Michael was when these phone calls were made. You weren't there. You're not really 100% sure that these are phone calls. So again, all good issues that are raised. On redirect, it's borne out that he spoke with Candace and Mr. DeCiro on multiple occasions, and that from listening to the context of the phone calls, these were clearly phone calls that happened on different days, and that it was apparent that Michael was in Nevada at the time, right? But it still was basically a question of where Michael was when the phone calls were being made. A good point that the prosecution made about where Michael was is that at one point he had custody of the kids. He was having visitation. Here's a little girl in the background talking to her mom and saying, "Hi, mommy." So it's clear that this is over the phone. It's clear that they're not together. She's talking to her mom. And Michael wasn't allowed to leave the state with the children without permission from Candace. So unless he was breaking the court order for family court and leaving the state without notice with the kids, then he was supposed to be in Nevada. It was likely making the phone call from Nevada, where the two-party rule would apply. So basically they called to the stand Candace Ruiz, and this is where Candace Ruiz, formerly Candace McDonald, and this is where they get into the meat and potatoes of the actual phone calls themselves. And guys, the phone calls, like I said, there's 5 of them. They are heart-wrenching. If you specifically listen to number 4 in the series of phone calls, you will hear the desperation with which Michael did not want to end his marriage.
No, I've been very bitter, Candace. I've been bitter about this whole thing. I didn't want to be divorced. I loved you. I didn't realize what I was doing to you.
She did not want a divorce. And that kind of gives a context to everything that Michael did throughout the duration of this case. He was obsessed with Joe. He was obsessed with her having a new boyfriend. He was so upset about it when she made it clear to him that she was going to get married. He was basically begging her. And the only reason I get into this part, because it actually makes me feel very sad for him. Not because I'm oh, it justifies anything that he did. It doesn't. It doesn't justify anything that he did before, during, or after his marriage. With regards to Candace, it only helps you to kind of understand the mental state of this person. He could not come to grips with it. It just caused such a cognitive dissonance for him that it seems like even if he had prior existing mental health issues, this really just pushed him over the edge, and I think really is what precipitated a lot of the more dangerous and concerning behavior, that he still wanted to keep control of Candace and the kids, and he was losing control, and you could hear it in his voice.
It's 100% how I feel. The best decision I ever made was to leave you.
Please find somebody better than Joe. I know you're better.
I can't imagine that a mentally well person would post those phone calls online thinking that it would make Candace look bad. All it did was just make him seem, desperate. And Candace, was pretty straightforward in saying this phone call was made on a different day. This was made around a certain holiday because of the things that we're talking about. This was made before the baby had her doctor's appointment and after the baby had her doctor's appointment. So we know that these are 2 separate phone calls. I know that this is a phone call because I said goodbye before I hung up the phone.
I'm gonna just get off the phone. We're not getting anywhere.
And even though no one ever said hello, and one of them she could hear, she would say goodbye.
Please?
No, there's nothing else to talk about. I'm getting off the phone with you. Goodbye.
So it was really devastating evidence. You could see the body language of Michael. He was basically folding in on himself as the audio recordings were being played. I'm sure that was opening up a wound for him, once again, I try to see the humanity in everyone, and it was clear that Michael needed mental health treatment. Like, that was always very clear, but that did not give him the right to like victimize his family. However, you cannot like be a human being and not see that this was like tearing him up to listen to himself beg like this. But it also makes it very, very clear that these are phone calls and that he recorded them, and that it's not Candace who's the bileless one. It's him because he's so upset. Candace had a lot of issues with the way in which Michael parented, and she expressed that from the beginning of the case. So, for example, she said, he brings back the kids dirty. And Judge Markey, I think, was trying to be very fair to Michael and saying, everyone parents differently. Maybe the kids played really, really hard and that's why they came back dirty, and so let's try to be a little bit more understanding and stuff like that. But no, he disagreed with the treatment program for their daughter. And so he was feeding her the wrong diet. The diet is what caused, and I didn't really get into this in the other videos, but this is really important. The diet caused her medical issue that Michael was blaming on Candace's boyfriend, right? Well, they figured out that if she was gluten intolerant and if she ate gluten-free, she did not have this medical injury reoccurring as long as she ate gluten-free. But it would happen when she would come back from her dad's house because the dad would still feed her gluten because basically he didn't believe in taking her gluten allergy seriously, which is really, really sad, And also, if the kids needed medical attention, he wasn't getting the medical attention. One of them had been bitten by a dog, and he said he wasn't going to take the child to the hospital, so Candace had to call the police in order for them to get the child medical treatment. I mean, it was clear that they had two completely different parenting styles, and that Michael's parenting style was a lot more lax, if not outright negligent. A good way to support that is not just what Candace was saying in the phone calls, but also online. Michael had posted video of himself teaching his son how to ride a bicycle without training wheels, which is fine, which is fine. That's what you should do. And it was something he was, bragging about to the court, like, oh, before Candace left me, I was teaching our son how to ride a bicycle without training wheels, and I need more time with my son because I'm going to teach him all this stuff, and we're going to go to this, fishing trips, and we're going to do all these things together, and I'm such a great dad, and I want to be their coach and all this type of stuff. Well, he's teaching the son how to ride without training wheels, and he doesn't have a helmet on the little boy, which is like a big no-no. It's very, very dangerous. And he's letting the boy, ride around without holding on to him or being close to him. And the boy falls in hard, like steers off and falls into a car, like the son, right? And falls down and hurts himself. And that's the kind of, and that, not to say that that couldn't happen when you're teaching your kids how to ride a bike without training wheels. It's just that he filmed it and put it online and says, oh, this is me teaching my kid how to ride a bicycle. But it wasn't really you teaching your kid how to ride a bicycle. It was you filming your kid on a bicycle without proper supervision, not paying attention to him, and then he falls hard into a car, into like an SUV, So I just felt like it was that in conjunction with the phone calls where Candace is basically super frustrated that her kids are not getting the care that she thinks that they deserve when they're in their father's care, showed you that more needed to change with Michael other than his ability to be a healthy husband. His ability to be a healthy father were severely compromised, and that's why he was supposed to take parenting classes and refused to take the parenting classes. But he needed them, right? So all of that comes out in these phone calls. Oh my God, that was such a, oh my God, I'm so sorry about that. That was so much background information that you didn't need. But all of that stuff gets played out in 2 days worth of testimony from Candace. Cross-examination of Candace was very interesting. Sister Mueller asked Candace if she had ever recorded Michael, to which she said no. He asked her if Michael had ever gone to California for a seminar because he was trying to establish that it's possible, reasonable doubt, there's a possibility that Michael wasn't present in Nevada when the phone calls were made, so two-party consent doesn't apply, nor does Nevada have jurisdiction. And she was like, I have no idea if he was in California. He was supposed to be in Nevada. So he was trying to establish this without having any witness that could establish that Michael was outside of the state when he made the phone call. He also pointed out that the phone calls never began with hello, that she used very nasty language when talking to Michael, that she was very upset, that she was yelling at him. And she admitted to that she was upset, she was yelling at him, and that she had threatened him that if he didn't pay child support, he would go to jail. And ultimately, all of that played into his closing arguments, which were basically like, this is all a plot by Candace to try to get Michael into jail because he won't pay child support. But you have to remember the fact, and this is what the state replied with, you have to remember the fact that these phone calls happened in 2016. Candace didn't become aware of them until much, much later. You know what I'm saying? When her and Michael were long since separated and divorced, there's no reason that she had to try to get him locked up at that time. Everything was settled between them. This was not about any type of political motivations or any type of relationship that Candace had with Mark DeCiro or the detective. This was about the fact that it's clear that these phone calls were recorded, that Michael was in possession of the phone calls on the same exact Google Drive, that he's likely the person who recorded the phone calls. They're clearly phone calls because they're coming through a speaker. They're clearly phone calls because she says goodbye before hanging up the phone. Clearly he's in Nevada because they're discussing taking the kid to the doctor, when how could he have taken the kid to the doctor if he wasn't in Nevada? He's got custody of the kids. How could he do that if he wasn't in Nevada? So the jury goes back and the jury deliberates. Once again, even though Mr. Mueller got real testy with the witnesses, even though Mr. Mueller is real animated, he did a good job of drawing out reasonable doubt about whether or not these were phone call recordings and whether or not these were separate conversations. The jury did not believe or could not sustain that all of the phone calls were separate conversations that happened on different days. So they only found that there were 2 separate conversations and found him guilty of 2 counts of unlawful wire interception or unlawful interception of wire communications, and found him not guilty of 3 counts of unlawful interception of wire communications. And the case was continued in order for Mr. McDonald to be sentenced. The case with Judge Israel, which is tried first in time, so convicted first in time, is continued out because Judge Israel gives Mr. McDonald the grace of allowing him the opportunity to be qualified for and complete mental health court. Mental health courts are diversionary courts where people with mental health issues can go in order to either avoid doing prison time, or they can go there in order to avoid doing prison time plus having the conviction remain on their record. It usually has some type of mechanism by which you can get your record expunged. Mr. McDonald's attorney, Craig Mueller, was supposed to submit Mr. McDonald for an application for mental health court, so the case was continued out. At the first date for sentencing on which the case was continued, Mr. Mueller wasn't present. He had another associate come and stand in for him, and it appeared that the application for mental health court had not been submitted. The case was continued again. Mr. Mueller was late. He had not submitted the mental health court application. It's more of the post-trial behavior, not the trial behavior, that I take the most issue with as far as Mr. Mueller is concerned, because again, I think he did a really good job in the trial. I think he was a very zealous advocate for his client. But when it came to the post-trial practice, I don't agree with how Mr. Mueller conducted himself for a lot of that. So he was late again for the third one. I think for the fourth one, he didn't show up altogether. There was another one where he told the court to the judge's face, yeah, we've done the application for mental health court. I'm just waiting for it to come back. And the mental health court administrator said they didn't have it. They come back again, come to find out he hadn't submitted the application for mental health court. He had only submitted it the day before this next court date when he was supposed to have submitted it a month earlier. So he had misrepresented to the court that he had submitted this application allegedly. And he was very, very late for court. The judge says he better come in or else I'm going to be holding him in contempt. Like, it was a mess. Like, it was clear that Mr. Mueller, for whatever reason, was trying to delay.
Yesterday, he represented that the application had been already submitted. It looks like that may not have actually been the case.
Over a month to apply. He hasn't done it. He's not even here. Get him here. Get him on the phone. Tell him he's going to be sanctioned if he's not present.
Case finally comes for the sentencing, and Mr. Mueller advances a motion to set aside the verdict and a motion for a new trial. And the argument that Mr. Mueller is relying on, instead of the normal argument for a motion to set aside the verdict, which is that the verdict is contradictory to the evidence. So say all the evidence points to your client being innocent, and then the jury finds your client guilty anyway, that would be, of course, the reason that you would do a motion JNOV, a motion to set aside the verdict. Mr. Mueller's basis was that this was a political prosecution, that it's not normal for someone to be prosecuted for false documents that they file in family court, that people that were witnesses in the case had their own political aspirations, and that they basically lied. Mr. Mueller also took issue again over and over. This is something I didn't really address. But, our Nevada judges got permission as press to film inside of the courtroom for all of Mr. McDonald's court dates. Mr. Mueller was fighting that over and over and over again. He was accusing our Nevada judges of being this biased organization that didn't really have any media value, that were making things difficult for his client and violating his client's privacy. But you have to remember that under the Constitution, all trials are public, and it's within the court's discretion who they allow to film or not film. Some states don't allow filming at all, but if states do allow filming from the media, if they've allowed the media access and our Nevada judges is deemed media, the fact that you don't like them is not really a reason to make them go away. But basically, he was like, throughout all of the proceedings in front of Judge Israel and Judge Silva, he was like yelling and screaming about the media being there. And I think it had more to do with the fact that he was getting really negative feedback on his performance as an attorney than it had to do with any impact that it was really having on Mr. McDonald. It was very strange how he was very focused in on them. He tried to make them kind of like one of the bases for his motion for a new trial or motion to set aside the verdict. The state, on the other hand, argued that there was no real basis for this motion, that the evidence was more than strong to find that Mr. McDonald committed perjury, burglary, issuing a false document, that he committed all of these crimes, and that there was no reason to overturn the conviction. The judge agreed with the state and basically found that, look, we've already litigated this argument that you're making, that it's a political hit job. It's not relevant to whether or not Mr. McDonald actually committed these offenses. And in fact, Mr. Mueller cited to this Nevada statute called NRS 175.381, which gives the court the discretion to set aside a jury verdict. And he was basically saying, look, court, you have, Judge Israel, you have the authority to set aside this jury verdict if it was politically motivated, if the prosecution was politically motivated. And that's in fact not what the statute says. The statute says that the judge only has the right to set aside a verdict if the verdict is contrary to the evidence, which the court did not find here. So despite all of his delays, and I want to make it really, really clear here, that by not submitting the application for mental health court, Mr. Mueller, in my opinion, again, unless Michael didn't want to do it at all and there was no way to convince him, really disadvantaged Mr. McDonald, because Mr. McDonald had the opportunity to avoid jail time. Just like in the other case where they offered a plea to just probation and mental health treatment and Mr. McDonald wouldn't take it, Mr. McDonald was kind of getting a second bite at the apple in this case to a plea for just probation and mental health court. Like, the state wasn't even really seeking to put this guy in jail. They just wanted him to get the help that he needed. But Mr. Mueller wouldn't submit his application for mental health court, didn't do it until super belatedly, and the judge was just tired of the whole situation. And thereby, Mr. McDonald was severely disadvantaged, and he, ended up getting the sentence that he got. Mr. Mueller's argument in mitigation was just basically that, again, this is a politically motivated thing, because let's really think about why he keeps talking about it's politically motivated because Michael ran for office. There's nothing to argue on the facts. By the letter of the law, even to Michael's own admission, to the statements he's made before now, he knows that he's guilty of forging this document and submitting it to the court. What Mr. Mueller's argument was basically is that it's not that serious. And that's never really a good argument for the court. Perjury is a really serious charge. In some states, having perjured yourself means that you can't vote. In some states, having perjured yourself means that you can't get certain positions. In some states, having perjured yourself means that you can't hold elected office. So the courts take perjury very seriously. Ms. Mishler's rebuttal to Mr. Mueller's argument was basically that Mr. McDonald only received a small percentage of the vote. I think like 1 or 2% of the vote. And it could be because he shares the same name with someone that was more well known on the Republican ticket. There was another man named Michael McDonald that was running for office as a Republican. And so that's probably where he got most of his votes from. But he wasn't even a blip on the political radar. Nobody was thinking about Michael McDonald running for office and disrupting the family law system. The judge agreed with Ms. Mishler and imposed the following sentence. So on all the counts, Judge Israel imposed a sentence of 12 to 34 months for all of the counts. And for all of the counts except for count 8, the counts will run concurrently. That means all at the same time. Except with count 8, Judge Israel made that count run consecutively. So that was going to run 12 to 34 months plus 12 to 34 months for an aggregate sentence of 24 to 68 months. Mr. McDonald did make an allocution before his sentence was imposed. He seemed to still be pretty much defiant. He was just still maintaining the line that the orders were contradictory. He didn't understand that he was supposed to stay away from his wife, which really wasn't at issue with the perjury, and that he was really being punished for just filing some documents. And it wasn't that big of a deal because the licensed family therapist would have said that anyway.
Then I brought it to her attention while I was on the way out. Hey, you forgot to add that sentence. She said, hey, I can't do it now. I have another client. This case should have been dismissed just on Rule 3.70 alone.
So it was really interesting that Michael was still holding to the line of, ultimately, I didn't do anything wrong. He was pretty much unrepentant for his behavior and still didn't seem to get why it was that he was in the situation that he was in. Once again, probably why mental health court would have helped him to try to gain some insight. And he could have avoided the prison sentence that he got of 24 to 68 months. So then we proceeded on to Judge Silva's court. Judge Silva basically heard the same exact arguments from Mr. Mueller, that the case should be overturned. The media coverage was unfair. It's a political hit job. We should not proceed with this case. Overturn the conviction, basically. And Judge Silva reached the same conclusion that Judge Israel reached, which is that the jury reached a very reasoned decision. They found Mr. McDonald not guilty on some of the charges, guilty on other charges, and that there was enough evidence to back up the jury's verdict. So they proceeded to sentencing as well. In that, the state requested a sentence of 14 to 36 months. Mr. Mueller was basically requesting that Mr. McDonald only receive probation and no additional active jail time, since he had just received active jail time in front of Judge Israel. Mr. McDonald gave a mitigating statement. He made a statement of allocution to the court. And in his statement of allocution to the court, he seemed to be a lot more repentant. Although it wasn't perfect, but it was better. It was better. He seemed to be a lot more repentant and understanding of why he was there, right? He did apologize for his actions. He didn't just apologize for being there, which is something he did in front of Judge Israel. He apologized exactly for what he did.
Just want to ask for your grace and mercy and consideration that this will never happen again. I've learned my lesson. I can't believe how emotional and dumb I was. I know the pitfalls that I fell into. And now I understand that a lot of that stemmed from my past. And I've gone through all kinds of different things, magnetics, and different things to help and learn to help people as well, Judge.
Because it's interesting, with Judge Israel, he was basically trying to interrupt the sentencing procedure. He was trying to fire Mr. Mueller. He was trying to make his own arguments to dismiss the case in his allocution. He used that as an opportunity to make a motion to overturn the conviction.
And then I get forgery charges, Judge. Now, if you look at the Attorney General opinion, forgery is the attempt to alter a document, the intent to damage or defraud. I had no intent to damage or defraud at all.
And none of that worked. So I think that he, recalibrated himself. Then Candace gave what's called a victim impact statement. And it was very eloquent. You guys need to watch it in its entirety in order to see. But basically, she made a case for how terrorized she had been by Michael's behavior over the course of the divorce proceedings.
Over the past 5 years, I've had to protect myself and our children from Michael's erratic and violent behavior. While Michael would like you to believe the charges brought against him were unfair or done unknowingly on his behalf, this is simply not the case. Michael knowingly recorded very private phone calls between him and me and shared those recordings with strangers, as well as posted them to YouTube. In those YouTube videos, Michael included not only the phone calls, but also pictures of me in bra and panties, pictures of our children, private text messages, cards and letters I had written to him, and photos of my most private journal entries.
Mr. Mueller did make some type of commentary or facial expression that Judge Silva found to be distasteful, and she had to admonish him while Mrs. Ruiz was making her victim impact statement.
I feared that the consequences for Michael's freedom could result in my death, or the deaths of our entire family.
Mr. Mueller, do you want to take a time out so you can control yourself? Because you're going to give Ms. Ruiz, as I would ask any person to give any victim, the respect they deserve. Do you need a break?
No.
Now, Candace did ask for Michael to receive the maximum possible penalty. Judge Silva was very considered in the sentence that she gave. So she did not give Michael the maximum possible sentence. She gave him a sentence of 14 months to 36 months, which is what the state had requested, but she ran it consecutive to the case that was imposed by Judge Israel. So the sentence imposed by Judge Israel was 24 to 68, and so she gave him 14 to 36 plus 24 to 68. And Michael was taken back to prison. And he did get credit for 215 days time served. Mr. Mueller was trying to get him credit for like 500 days, but Mr. McDonald hadn't been held that long. I don't know when he's going to be getting out, if it's going to be closer to the 3 years, 2 years, or closer to 5 years. Either way, he's going to be sitting there for a little while, and hopefully he's receiving the mental health treatment that he needs. There's so many more things about this case that I didn't cover, but I really wanted to just delve into the criminal area of it. So in conclusion, I want to thank Candace for giving me the opportunity to review this case. I want to thank all of you for following along with this long form content, and I want to thank our Nevada judges for providing a lot of the background information on the case. A portion of the proceeds of these 3 videos will be donated to the House of Ruth, which is an organization that helps people and families that are dealing with and escaping from domestic violence. I will put a link in the description box down below to the organization that I'm donating to. By watching this video, you have helped me to donate to that organization. So I am donating in the name of this channel, Natalie Lawyer Chick. And again, I want to thank you all so much for your support, and I'll see you later. Bye.